Welcome back to Key Messianic Prophecies, a podcast brought to you by Telios, a private 501c3 nonprofit foundation dedicated to the research and accurate teaching of the Bible, founded by Bill and Jeanette Stewart. Now, on this episode, we will be covering Psalm 45. You will sometimes hear Psalm 45 identified as a kind of wedding song concerning one of the ancient kings of Israel. And though biblical scholarship does recognize the messianic flavor of the psalm, many contend that such a reading is beyond the scope of the original piece. Yet, if you've been following this series, you'll know that we have been building a case for reading the book of Psalms as a whole by focusing on the placement of specific psalms within the Psalter. We have seen a kind of messianic narrative emerge throughout the entire book, so that Psalm 45 is less a wedding hymn geared towards some ancient king, and much more specifically a celebration of the glories of Israel's future messianic king. Psalm 45 contains two primary stanzas, the first offering a kind of physical description of the Davidic king, and the second offering a look at the king's splendor in his palace and upon his throne. The throne is identified in verse 6 as being God's throne, and the kingdom ruled is described as God's kingdom, indicators of the divine nature of this messianic king. Yet we also meet in this psalm the character of the bride as well as her bridesmaids. And the inclusion of this character is one of the biggest concerns raised when discussing a messianic interpretation of this psalm. What is this wedding banquet being described, and who is the bride? Well, here we will contend that the best understanding of the bride is a metaphorical one, describing the people of God, specifically Israel. However, we find that the bride's procession also consists of bridesmaids, characters who are not the bride, and we will contend that these bridesmaids are from the nations. In other words, the bride's procession is made up not only of Jews, but of people from other nations as well. Notice in verse 12 of this psalm, one of the bridesmaids is described as a daughter of Tyre, language that is used throughout the Old Testament to describe different people groups. Daughter of Zion, for example, speaks of Israel and Jerusalem previously in Psalm 9, verse 14. So we find foreign nations present at this wedding banquet for this messianic king and his people. Consistently throughout the Old Testament, we find the marriage metaphor used to describe God's relationship to his people. The covenant at Sinai, for example, is described as a marriage, while Israel's idolatry is described as adultery. And the location of Psalm 45 within the Psalter also lends credence to the notion that the bride is God's people finally drawing near to him. Consider that Psalm 44 ends with a number of requests for redemption from a seemingly remote God, requests which are answered and celebrated in Psalm 46 and onward, thus positioning Psalm 45 as this very specific turning point, one that sees the king united to his bride, the impetus for a shift from mourning to rejoicing. We also find allusions throughout this psalm to the Genesis 49 prophecy concerning the Messianic king, which we discussed back in episode 5 of this series. We find the Psalm 45 king triumphs over his enemies. We see the scepter ruling God's kingdom. We also see striking physical similarities. So, all this to say, Psalm 45 seems to maintain the messianic overtones that carry throughout the Psalter. Here we have the picture of the king finally coming to rescue his bride. We see the union of the two separate parties, a wedding banquet at which all are welcomed who are in the procession. And with their enemies vanquished, the stage is now set for the celebratory psalms that immediately follow, beginning with Psalm 46. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Key Messianic Prophecies, and on the next episode we will be taking a look at Psalm 69.